morning. Welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to those of you who are open to the realization that all of the world's religious, political, economic, and military institutions are corrupt, even counterproductive. I am Yahowah. Our number, if you'd like to join us over the next couple of hours, is toll-free 877-300-7645. Continuing with a story published by the New York Times regarding the departure of young Syrian girls, some as young as 12 and 13 years old, out of countries like the UK, but throughout Europe, to join the Islamic State in Syria. We find that the article continues by saying that their families receive phone calls in occasion, and they exchange social media communications, and the girls tell them that they have left Europe. They have left their homes in the UK or throughout Europe because they want to leave behind an immoral society in search of religious virtue and meaning. Now I paused there, and I'm sure you understand why I paused. I'm not suggesting that there is religious meaning or virtue or morality to be found in Europe. Political correctness has seen to it that there is no thoughtfulness, and without good judgment, there is no morality. Without accountability, there is no morality. And so these things certainly do not exist in Europe. But think of just how deluded, how irrational, how amoral you would have to be to go towards an organization to seek participation in a human institution that is engaged in the wholesale kidnap and enslavement and gang rape, the literal sale of little girls for sex slaves. And you're a woman, and you're going to go and be part of that group because you are seeking morality and religious purpose in life. There is no question that the Islamic State is doing this en masse, that they're proud of it, that they're publishing their documents as to how Islam condones it, and in fact the Quran and Hadith do condone it. But to think that such an organization is a place where you'll find meaning in life and morality, just think of how stupid you have to be. Now, going another step, the crucifixions that are taking place in the world today, who are they being perpetrated by? Fundamentalist Muslims, particularly the Islamic State. The decapitations, particularly mass decapitations, where scores of innocent people, civilians, have their hands tied behind their backs, their feet are tied, they're humiliated, and then they are slowly tortured and murdered as their heads are sawed from their bodies. And you're going to look for meaning in life from an organization that not only does this, but videotapes it while reading from the Quran to celebrate it. This is an organization that uses chemical weapons. This is an organization that has committed grotesque acts of child torture, filming them, kidnap, the slave trade, thievery, mass murder, and of course, terrorism. And you're a little girl growing up in the UK or throughout Europe, and you've been beguiled into thinking that you need to leave the UK to find this bastion of morality and of religious meaning in life. Have you been dumbed down to that position? You know, it's so sad is that in the media and in politics, if the leaders, the spokespeople in those areas were to shed their goddamn ignorance of Islam, if they were to read the Quran and Hadith, or read Prophet of Doom that takes the Quran and puts it in chronological order using the Hadith so that Islam is easy to understand, best documented, most comprehensive, most chronological presentation ever compiled of the 5 earliest and most credible Islamic sources, and to speak out against the religion, its foundations, so that everyone on earth knows that it is a literal assessment of Islam, a fundamentalist view of Islam, a Quranic and Hadith view of Islam. It is the Islam of Muhammad and Allah that the Islamic State is perpetrating upon all of those that it can impose its savage will, and that is the Islam that is leading to these perverse, immoral acts. If they only had the wisdom, the courage, the moral fortitude, the good judgment, the compassion to say these things, it would give at least some of these girls pause, where they'd say, why am I leaving to go be part of that? And if nothing else, then at least expose the stupidity of the religion, so that people know that since the Quran claims that Alexander the Great went to visit extraterrestrials who live in a muddy spring where the sun goes to bed at night, that there is a zero possibility that that is true. There's a zero possibility, therefore, that the Quran is true, and that this promise of multiple virgins and paradise for those who killed on Muslims isn't true. These little girls tell their parents, I don't feel like I belong in this era. Now, feeling. That's the essence of religion. It's all about feeling. That's not how I feel about it. That I feel this way. Faith and feeling are synonymous because there's no thinking involved. And of course, Islam doesn't belong in this era, which is why they don't feel like they belong in this era. Islam is mired in the era of Muhammad, of ignorance, of violence, of rape, of enslavement of humans. This story goes on. It says, as Muslims, the girls would be treated very differently from the women and girls of the Yazidi minority, who are taken by the Islamic State as slaves and raped with justification that they are unbelievers. So, well, that's true. That the Yazidi girls are treated differently. I wouldn't say very differently than Muslim girls. I mean, the difference is that the Yazidi girls, because they are not Muslims, are literally enslaved. They're sold as slaves, and they are gang raped as slaves, with the justification coming from the Quran. With the case of the Muslim girls, they are essentially slaves, but they're slaves to one individual, as opposed to being slaves to whomever buys them. And while they are raped, they will have to provide sex that is of no pleasure to them at their husband's demand. And he can kill them, starve them, beat them, according to Muhammad's farewell sermon. The reality is that they have no rights. They have fewer rights than we provide domesticated animals. So they are, in essence, slaves, but slaves to one as opposed to slaves to many. But again, if you realize this group is enslaving and gang raping little girls who just disagree with Islam, why would you want to be part of a group that does that? This continues with a all-female morality militia. Now imagine that, a morality militia in the most immoral religion ever conceived by man. Published a manifesto stipulating that women are not to be educated after age 15. Well, of course, why would you want a woman who has no rights to be educated? If she's educated, then she might argue with the man and say, what you're doing to me is immoral, inappropriate, perverted. This religion is immoral. It's perverted. It's stupid. It's obviously false. So you wouldn't want the women to be educated. The men, they get to do anything they please. They can engage in rape. They can engage in thievery. They can engage in murder. They can engage in kidnap. They can engage in terrorism. And they have total control over the bodies of whatever woman they might find. You already got them. If that's the kind of thing that appeals to you, then you're as good as theirs. But for the women, don't educate them, because what if they start to think? It also says that these women, Muslim women, can be married as young as 9. And I've said this so many times. Do not assimilate the term marriage in Islam with the term marriage in the West, with any understanding that you would apply to a marriage. There is no aspect of an Islamic marriage that would be consistent with what we consider to be marriage in the West. These women essentially become slaves. But here, they said that they can become the property of men as early and as young as age 9. Now, why do you think they picked 9? And first of all, do you think that it's appropriate to impose sex on a girl, or even to have sex with a girl who is 9 years old? And of course, the answer in any civil society would be no. Any moral evaluation of age and sex would say no, that is immoral. But not in Islam. What is immoral, it becomes moral in Islam. But the reason they picked 9 is according to the hadith, the oral reports from Muhammad and his companions. Aisha, Muhammad's first sex toy, was 9 years old when he officially had sex with her. He was 53 at the time. This juxtaposition of religion, morality, and perverted sexual behavior, terrorism, and mass murder is so fascinating. And the thing that makes it fascinating is the inability of those who are close to it to see it, and how they have been twisted to the point that they see terrorism is good. Rape is good when it's applied to others, and bad when it's applied to them. It's an astonishing situation. And what's most astonishing is that with every day there being 3 or 4 headlines of a dastardly deed being done by fundamentalist Islamic groups. Suicide bombings, terrorism, mass murder, beheadings, kidnapping, gang rapes, selling children into slavery. The whole episode of there in Pakistan where they're kidnapping boys, sodomizing them, filming it, and then blackmailing them. The situation, the deadliest act in Thailand's history recently with the Islamic bombing of a local shrine there. And yet with all of this, with terrorist acts big and small, all being perpetrated by Muslims, where they have a virtual monopoly. I mean, it's greater than what any monopoly you'd ever consider. It's 99.9%. Justified by, confessed to by, deployed and carried out by Muslims, citing the Quran and Hadith. And yet, there isn't a single spokesperson of any consequence in the media and global politics or in academia that's willing to say, why are we ignoring the obvious? There's a singular common denominator with all of this. Why aren't we holding Islam accountable? Why aren't we exposing and condemning this criminal enterprise? You know, it's as if the entire world says, I don't give a crap if you kill me. I don't care how many little girls are raped. I don't care how many ancient ruins are destroyed. I don't care how many people are crucified or are decapitated. I don't care that the slave trade is back and prevalent. I don't care that hundreds of thousands of people are dying. I don't care that tens of millions of people are now refugees. I don't give a crap. Because the last thing I want to do is to get off my duff long enough to figure out the truth for myself. I don't care enough to take a few hours to read the Quran and Hadith, and I certainly don't have the courage or compassion to hold the religion that is perpetrating these crimes accountable, nor to speak out against it. Because I really don't care. Isn't that where we are? Particularly those that are paid to make these assessments, politicians, those in the media, those in the military, those in academia. Collectively, we have a world of comatose people. As I said the other day, the movies about the ghoulish goblins of zombies, well, they look a little prettier. They don't have, blood dripping down their eyes. They don't walk funny. But in terms of thoughtlessness, of a collective groaning towards that which is deadly, doesn't that describe the vast preponderance of people today? This quote from a Mrs. Havlick. She says that for the girls, joining the Islamic State is a way to emancipate yourself from your parents and from the Western society that has let you down. How in the hell has Western society let them down? And tell me, how has Western society let them down? Dear politically correct moron, Miss Havlick? For the Islamic State, of course, she uses ISIS because she doesn't want to say political correctness prevents her from saying the Islamic State, so she just uses ISIS. It's great for troop morale. Troop morale. Does the Islamic State have troops? Do you see them out there in military garb with ranks? Do they have boot camps and manuals on rank and officer levels? No. They're jihadists. They're civilians turned killers. They're not troops. Good grief. Why can't you think this through? Do you want them to be troops so that we can deploy our military and it's mano a mano? Because fighters want Western wives. In the battle for ideas, they can point to the girls and say, see, they took us. This article says that the reason the Islamic State jihadists, although they didn't use the term jihadist, are desirous of having these young children come join them is because they're choosing the Caliphate over the West. That's the nature of faith. It requires these kind of ridiculous proofs. That's why when I wrote Prophet of Doom and I proved conclusively that everything about Islam was a fraud and a farce and counterproductive and destructive and deadly and damning and deceitful, the Muslims just couldn't handle it. They went berserk. And all of them, almost universally, said, you really know the truth. You know that Islam is the greatest religion. You know that the Quran is true. You're just saying it to make money, or you're saying it to do this, that, or the other thing. But you really know the truth. Or they'd say, that Islam is the world's fastest growing religion. Well, it's not true. But, and almost any aspect of it that even made it somewhat credible to make the statement has nothing to do with people choosing Islam, but the fact that they're breeding like rabbits. And you realize that religious faith requires this kind of reinforcement. because they've got nothing else. All of the evidence, all of the facts, all of the scriptural statements demonstrate that it's a complete hoax. So for them collectively to cling to this stupidity, they feed off of, well, see, there was somebody that had a choice, and she chose us over them. Asked about failing to spot the signs that the girls were radicalized, the spokesman for the Metropolitan Police in London maintained that there had been no indication during the interviews that any of these girls were in any way vulnerable or indeed radicalized. And you'd think that the person writing this article would say, gee, maybe that's because they weren't radicalized. Maybe that's because this whole concept of radicalization is stupid. They weren't radicalized. They were just Muslims. They were Muslims seeking to be better Muslims. So there would be nothing unique about them other than they were Muslims seeking to know more about their religion, seeking to be more like Muhammad, seeking to be more fundamentalist. This concept of radicalization, that they're being taken into a direction that is somehow unique and distinct from fundamentalist Islam, from the Quran and Hadith, is the part of this whole discussion that is leading people astray. So, no, there was no sign that they were radicalized. There was no indication they were vulnerable to radicalization, because there is no radicalization. There's no such thing as a radical Muslim. And the Muslims that are perpetrating terror aren't radicals, they're fundamentalists. In her post under the name Uthman was one of the most vicious of all Muslims. Typical teenage commentary is increasingly mixed with posts inquiring about how to learn Arabic quickly and what behavior is Islamic and what is not. Like I said, their goal is to become better Muslims. They want to read Arabic so that they can communicate and read the Quran in Arabic. Of course, they don't know that the Quran is actually written in Hebrew, but nonetheless, they want to learn Arabic. They want to know what behavior is Islamic. Well, all you got to do, dear child, is look what Islamic groups are doing. What are they groups that you are desiring to be part of? What are they doing? Kidnap? Slave trade? Mass murder? Decapitations? Thievery, crucifixion, rape, pedophilia. You know, if it's institutionalized, we're not talking about a few losers. We're talking about institutionalized behavior that is justified by the religious writings themselves, and you would know what behavior is Islamic. What is the most Islamic of all behaviors? Jihad. Then here's just something. Talk about stupid. Are nose piercings haram or not? Haram would be considered bad. Halal would be considered good. Halal, of course, is Satan's name, according to Yahowah. This is what is, I'm so confused, is what's forbidden under Islam. Nose piercings, are they forbidden? 2 weeks later she wrote, the Prophet, peace be unto him, curse those who pluck their eyebrows. Curse those who pluck their eyebrows. I share that with you for a number of reasons. One is the prophet, capital P. To be a prophet, you have to not only make predictions, your predictions have to come right, to come to fruition, and you can't have like a 1 in 10 batting average. To be a real prophet, capital P, every prediction you make has to come true as you predicted it. So how is it that you could be so stupid as a Muslim that you don't realize that Muhammad didn't meet any of these criteria? That the Quran itself says that Muhammad wasn't a prophet. Why would you call him a prophet if the Quran itself says that he wasn't a prophet? Why would you call him a prophet if there isn't a single prediction that he got right? Come on. It's not like, he got a slight majority right. It's not that he got some right. He got them all wrong. So why would you call him a prophet? And then why would you give a darn that he cursed girls who pluck their eyebrows. He likes furry girls. Why would you care? Why wouldn't you instead consider the fact that at 50 years old he had sex with a 6-year-old? And with 53 he was doing it regularly with a 9-year-old. And he filled his harem with slaves, many of whom were children under the age of 10. And that he is directly guilty, undeniably, of rape, where he had captive women whose husbands and fathers and brothers and children he had murdered, brought to his tent to ravage. And you'd be concerned that he condemned women who pluck their eyebrows? You haven't bothered to read or consider his farewell sermon where he says you can beat women. You can lock them up. You can starve them. You can leave them naked. But they're concerned that he said, you're bad if you pluck your eyebrows? And by the way, the other reason I read this to you is I've said over and over again that Islam is based on hadith, and that the Quran is just one of many hadith. It's an oral report from Muhammad and his companions brought to us by the same people in the same way. It says the same thing. The Quran is hadith, an oral report from Muhammad and his companions. And I've said over and over again that Islam is comprised of hadith. Sharia law is comprised of hadith. And that Muslims, good ones, the jihadists, the terrorists, all know the hadith, because the hadith is the only source of Muhammad's words and deeds, according to Muslims. Here's a little girl trying to become a better Muslim. What is she citing? The hadith. The article says, but far from portraying an increasingly submissive girl, Islam means submission. This is Amira's Twitter messages featured punchy fist emojis. What are those things called? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and they featured punchy fist versions of those. Yeah, she's not submissive. She's got punchy fist little cartoon characters.
You can feel the rage, huh?
Oh, God. No, she didn't submit to a religion where the name of the religion means submission. No, she's feisty because emoticons featured punchy fists. She says, this is our Baba game. She wrote under a photo of girls proudly clad in Muslim garb. Yeah, wearing their tents. This is our garb. It's strong to be covered like a tent. When she wrote about rape, hearing those stories of sisters being raped makes me so close to being allergic to men. In the name of Allah. And so here she's going to be part of the Islamic State. She is part of the Islamic State. The Islamic State is telling you that they are justified in what they're doing because Islamic women are being raped. When in fact, the opposite is true. Muslims are raping non-Muslims by the tens of thousands. When people are this stupid, when they've lost the capacity to be moral, to exercise good judgment, to be thoughtful, this is what happens. And by the way, it wasn't this girl's fault alone. It was her parents, it was society's, for not exposing and condemning this religion. This sense as a literalist interpretation of Islam promoted by Saudi Arabia has become more mainstream and has combined with a widely shared sense that Muslims across the world suffer injustices in which the West is complicit. A literalist interpretation. So how can they be radicalized if it's a literalist interpretation? Isn't literalist mean literal? Doesn't literal mean that's what the word said? Look at the words, read the words, and based upon what the words say, form your conclusions. That's what Prophet of Doom is all about. It looks at the words and says, this is what the words mean. These are the only rational conclusions that can be drawn from these words. Islam is a terrorist manifesto. It started as a crime syndicate. Everything that it calls good is bad. Everything it calls bad is good. The Quran is filled with all manner of myth, deceptions, and lies. The fundamental lie of Islam is that rather than confirming the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, rather than being inspired by the same God who inspired the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, it is the antithesis of those things, and its wannabe God is the adversary. And yet, here they recognize that it is a literalist interpretation of Islam that is being promoted by Saudi Arabia. But it's that same literal interpretation of Islam that is lived by the Islamic State, that is lived by Boko Haram, that is lived by all jihadist Muslims worldwide. And indeed, it is growing in popularity. About 3/4 of Muslims around the world are fundamentalists. Why is it? That's a legitimate question. Why is it that this author, a journalist, someone educated, indoctrinated in a politically correct institution, in a previous paragraph spoke of no signs of radicalization with these girls. And then in their next paragraph, they're saying that a literalist interpretation of Islam promoted by Saudi Arabia has become more mainstream. Why can't they put those things together and say, wait a minute, then it isn't radicalization, it's fundamentalism? Why can they miss signs this blunt, this bold, this irrefutable and undeniable? We were talking during the break, Scott, if I were to teach you the fundamentals of golf, would you become a radical golfer? If you were to teach me the fundamentals of basketball, would I be an extremist player? Or would I be someone who played within the rules, who understood the game as the game was designed to be played? Well, why can't people make that same connection? If you're schooled in the fundamentals of Islam, you will take a literal interpretation. Any interpretation of the words that isn't literal takes you to an extreme, one way or the other. But there is no way to be a radical and a literalist. These are impossibilities. Now, the next part of this, of course, is promoted by Saudi Arabia. Well, if it's a literal interpretation, how could it be promoted by Saudi Arabia? Wouldn't the literalist interpretation of Islam, literal, be the Quranic interpretation? Wouldn't that be the interpretation of the Hadith? You know, which one would it be? And these things are not difficult to figure out. But here they recognize that it's become mainstream. And it has. Every election that has taken place in the last 5 to 10 years has showed anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of those people voting for the most fundamentalist candidate. Polls show the same thing. The other part of this that's always interesting is that almost in any political or religious doctrine, every time there's a problem within the community or the institution or the nation, no matter where it might be, they always want to blame an outside force. This has been the case of Islam from its beginning. As a matter of fact, Islam was conceived this way. Jews were to blame. Nazi Germany, the Jews were to blame for the plight of Germans. In America now, it's the one percenters. It's the fossil fuel companies, it's the bankers, it's everybody else is to blame for the plight of individuals. No one takes responsibility. In Greece, it was the European dictators and the blackmailers that are to blame for their plight, not their own dependency and indulgence. So everybody wants to blame somebody else. No one wants to take responsibility. Nobody is responsible. And so the plight of Islam is obvious. Everything Islam touches, it destroys. It has for 1,400 years. And so because it's obvious that Muslims are in a vastly inferior position as a direct result of their religion, what do? They blame everybody else. And rather than thinking it through and say, wait a minute, if the West is to blame for the horrid conditions that Islam exists in, for the tendency of Muslims to be terrorists and mass murderers and decapitators and slave traders and pedophiles and rapists, that if those are the traits within the Islamic community that are so pervasive, why don't we see those traits more pervasive in the West if the West is imposing them on us? Why are we the worst at all of these uncivilized activities if, in fact, the civilized countries are imposing them upon us and they're not as bad at any of them? This notion, this little girl says, I don't want to even be around men anymore because of the rape of our Muslim sisters, but doesn't see that the institutionalizing and justification of rape is among those that she sought to join. This is also interesting. I told you that her father was also a composer, the parents were composer. It says after the girls vanished, it emerged that the Amira's father, Hussein Abbas, had been filmed attending an Islamist rally way back in 2012 that was organized by a notorious hate preacher. This is Qadari. He's the guy that's been brought up so many times for his honest and accurate portrayal of Islam. And that it was also attended by another one of the girls' fathers. And so here are these parents ascribing to fundamentalist Islam.